Hello and welcome to MySecurityTV and our Tech and Sec Weekly. My name's Chris Cubbage. I'm the Executive Editor with MySecurity Media, and this is our Friday morning episode. And this morning we're going to be looking at national security and intelligence and also the future for the security industry here in Australia. First up, we're going to be looking at national security and intelligence. A new report has called for a Minister for Intelligence at a federal level. We're going to be joined from the Australian National University in Canberra, Dr William Stoltz, who's the author of the report. And also great to have Professor John Blaxland joining us again as well this morning. And they will be first up. And then we're going to be joined by Dr Gavriel or Gav Schneider, who is the Group CEO and Principal Consultant with Risk2Solution. And he's got too many hats on. I had to fit it all into this particular tile. He's the Conference Convenor for the Protective Security in Government, conference, which starts next week. On a virtual conference, unfortunately, but it was scheduled to be in Canberra. And he's also the project co-lead and senior researcher for the Security 2025, a roadmap for the future report, which looks at the security sector and is also calling for a new sort of structure to the Department of Home Affairs on managing the security industry at a federal level. So we're going to be looking at, again, Security 2025 roadmap for the future with Dr. Gav Schneider. So stay with us. If you are tuning in, let us know where you're listening from. We should be streaming on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook. We cover off on aerospace and space, defence and national security, cyber security and critical technology, and cities and infrastructure. And these sessions will be split up following this live session and available individually, and also go out as a cybersecurity weekly podcast. We will go for the full hour. And again, this is conversational and you're welcome to throw in any questions or comments along the way. And I'll keep a note on the chats as well. So, and let us know where you're listening. That way I know that our stream is actually working. Just to rehash, it's been a busy week for us so far. On Wednesday, we ran a Women in Space panel session. Thank you to Simone Ray, who moderated that session. She's the Director of the Defence Innovation Partnership in South Australia. And thank you also to Lockheed Martin Australia, who sponsored this particular session. And this is also part of World Space Week. So happy World Space Week. I hope you've enjoyed it. And the theme for this year of World Space Week was Women in Space. And this also culminated in us launching our City 21 Festival of Space, which will be throughout November. So City is the Australian Space Industry Technology Infrastructure and Investment channel as part of our spaceanddefence.io channel as well. So hopefully you can join us for that. And again, we've got about 15 to 20 different sessions throughout that series. Also, we're now the official media partner to the Australian Cyber Week or Cyber Week with AusCyber. And on Tuesday, we're going to be joined by Michelle Price, who's the CEO of AusCyber, and she'll walk us through the lineup that they have. This is going to be the last week of October. And then also on Wednesday, we're going to be crossing to the US and here in Australia as well with ClearSale, looking at Facebook and LinkedIn data exposures, fraud trends and prevention frameworks with David Fletcher and Ralph Coy, who's the Australian country manager. And also we've just dropped this one. So this is the 28th of October with Motorola Solutions, looking at warehouse and manufacturing in transformation. So certainly if you're in those sectors and you are going through a digital transformation, this will be a good one for you. Looking at productive supply chain and strategic e-commerce hubs within manufacturing and warehousing. Thank you very much to Secure ID and RSA Business for their ongoing support of the channel. And if you want to support the channel, go to mysectv.shop and check out some of the merchandise and grab a t-shirt while you're there on our Cyber War series. So without further ado, I'm going to bring up our guests, Professor John Blaxland and Dr. William Stoltz from the Australian National University. And this should come up as I left it. Thank you, Will and John. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be
Thanks,
here.
Chris.
Great. Will, the report, the title of the report, I don't have it, actually, I do have it in front of me, but maybe introduce us to the report because it's quite far-ranging, but sort of culminated in a call for a minister for intelligence and sort of second-tier minister as well to guide. Maybe just the background to the report, because it does, and that's why I invited John on as well. It kind of encapsulates what's so much going on. We need someone to sort of be a pinpoint there to help and to focus on, right?
Yeah, precisely. And the report is really about trying to
put in place some practical recommendations for government, particularly for the political leadership in Australia, about how to grapple with the sheer complexity of our national security community. Most of your audience will probably be aware that in 2017, the Turnbull government created this new construct, the National Intelligence Community, to consolidate the intelligence and security agencies. And then at the same time also created the new what's often called super portfolio of Home Affairs. And creating these two new institutions essentially made the national security community writ large ever expanding and encompassing, to my account, approximately 16 agencies and departments. And since then, we've also had, as a result of, particularly the pandemic, we've had many of the health agencies become closer into the national security space. And then also because of, lots of technological issues around telecommunications, we've had institutions like the Department of Communications be drawn closer into the security space as well. So we're seeing this momentum for the security community to kind of continue to expand and kind of suck in ever more portions of government. And what that has meant is it's created quite a maze of agencies that, for the ministers, the National Security Committee of Cabinet, and for Parliament, it's really quite difficult for them to create strategy for, to understand the investments that are being requested, and also to undertake, the type of oversight that we expect from our political leadership. So this report was really a response to try and tease out some practical, actionable recommendations that government could implement to try and reconcile with that. And this idea of a Minister for Intelligence, it's not that original. People have kind of bandied about this idea for a while. But I suppose what I was arguing for is that it should be a minister under the Prime Minister in the Prime Minister's portfolio, someone who can kind of reach across the various sections of government that have security equities and actually help advise the National Security Committee of Cabinet about how to undertake their work, particularly the strategy setting, understanding investments, and importantly, also understanding the just huge number of national security law reforms that are slamming Parliament at the moment. If any of your audience are interested, look up the recent annual report for the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, because they list all the different inquiries they're working on. And it is incredible. It is such a complex and diverse range of topics that our political leaders are now having to grapple with in the national security space. And so in addition to the ministerial recommendation, I put in some other recommendations relating to that particular committee because of its importance. And these are just simple things like, for example, actually giving PJSIS members an advisor on their staff who has a security clearance. Many of your audience might be surprised that, such is the structure at the moment, the members of the PJSIS can receive classified briefings from agencies, but they can't turn to their own staff and actually say, what do you think? And how should we have a discussion about this? Which, just practical stuff like that would really help improve the ability of this committee to do its important work.
And we recently had Senator Erica Betts on. He was calling for a national forum on cybersecurity, and he's part of the PJCIS. And it was a little bit surprising that they come out individually, in terms of how they sort of speak to themselves in terms of government as well. And he was sort of calling on Minister Dutton. And John, I think just to underline and to sort of bring you on now, we've just before we came on air, we thought, let's have a look at this one. Maybe just talk us through this and your thoughts on the report and a Minister for Intelligence, how that fits in, because you've been calling obviously for national resilience, planning, and that type of approach as well. This really kind of underlines what you've been talking about anyway, potentially.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and congratulations, Will, on the report, which I think is really groundbreaking and very significant contribution. It does follow. Will didn't mention the Richardson review, which came out in 2019, which followed on from the Lestrange Merchant Review of 2017, which was the precursor to the reforms of the establishment of the National Intelligence Community, the 10 organisations in red on this chart, and of the establishment of the Home Affairs Department construct, which brought in the 5 red boxes on the right-hand side of that box of the national intelligence community under the Minister for Home Affairs in various guises. So ASIO's relationship is slightly different because it has an enduring relationship with the Attorney General as well. But Home Affairs Intel, AUSTRAC, Australian Transaction Reporting Centre, Australian Criminal Intelligence Centre. These are agencies that have grown in muscle, in relevance, in importance, in part because of what Will was talking about a moment ago, and you as well, Chris, the emergence of the cyber domain, the fact that we're now more, we've gone from a society that's web-enabled to web-dependent to web-vulnerable. And that process has generated a whole space for criminal activity, for international intrigue, and the requirement for greater intelligence oversight and response. But as you look at that, you've got the 10 red organisations, and then you've got various independent accountability mechanisms that have emerged over the years. A lot of them go back to the days of Justice Robert Marsden Hope and the very significant reforms that he instituted following the commissioning of a Royal Commission by Gough Whitlam in 1974, and then again by Bob Hawke in 1983, which those two Royal Commissions generated space for the Administrative Appeals Tribunal to have the Security Appeals Tribunal incorporated. The Independent National Security Legislation Monitor comes under afterwards as a result of Kevin Rudd's initiative, but especially the IGIS, the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security. These are really robust and powerful mechanisms that require resourcing. In addition, you've got on the left there in the light blue, what Will was talking about, the PJCIS or PJCIS, which is the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. Very important body. It's important to, when we think about it, people tend to conflate the Australian parliamentary system with the American model, not realising that they're actually water and oil. They're quite different, very significantly different constructs. And so for us, the PJCIS is not quite, it doesn't have the executive power of the executive government, because of the very different way we organise the executive arm of government, which comes out of the legislative, in other words, from the governing side of the lower house of representatives. So you see there in the diagram the crossing of the light blue and the green being the executive part of government that has oversight with various, including public servants and ministers with oversight. So the ministers with oversight are in the blue and green box. So, it's complicated. Yeah. So Will's right to point out the need for, it took me quite a few months to actually get this diagram together.
I was about to say, John, you had to. It was a work in progress online, really, wasn't it? That I saw.
It was a collaborative effort. A lot of people pitched in. It was an online thing. We put it on LinkedIn. And on Twitter, and got feedback from practitioners. He said, "No, John, you missed something. Yes. It's not quite right." So the emergence there, if you look at under the Defence Minister sector for the CDI, the CDI, what is the CDI? Chief Defence Intelligence. Well, he's half in and half out, and same with the Intelligence Capability Division and Headquarters Joint Operations Command. And
so this red line through these green organisations is on purpose.
Exactly.
Yep.
It goes to show you that they are part of the national intelligence community, but not completely within it. They have aspects of what they do is beholden to the legislation, and that really revolves around the Intelligence Services Act of 2001 as amended, plus the construct that came out of the 2017 review. So getting back to the point we're talking about today with Will's really helpful review, where do you put the minister? So you got the Prime Minister there at the top, and you've got PM&C, you've got, the key ministers there who are really in this space: Foreign Minister, Defence Minister, Treasurer, Attorney General, and Home Affairs Minister. So where does that sub-minister sit? Obviously, it would sit under the Prime Minister, adjacent to the PM&C box, with a role to, and I could defer to Will on this, but presumably to liaise across that space, work with the PJCIS, and help enable that, as well as the IGIS and the INSOM. Another part of that, the box in yellow, this is another part of this which is not widely understood. That's the SCONS, or the SCNS, the Secretary's Committee on National Security, which is the secretaries of the departments in that space. So the ones who work for the Foreign Minister, Defence, Treasurer, Attorney General, Home Affairs and Prime Minister, their representative, their public service heads work in that space. And then there's the HIAM in the middle of the red box, the heads of intelligence agencies meeting, which is responsive to the Director General of National Intelligence, the head of ONI, Office of National Intelligence, used to be Office of National Assessments. It's really complicated.
Yeah.
Even a junior minister in that space is going to be hard pressed to do this. So I would contend Will has gone a long way. Perhaps we need to go further and muscle up the IGES. Certainly, I agree with the idea of giving people with security clearances to work with these people who are on the PJCIS and give them a role to liaise with the NIC agencies and with the departments through that minister in particular and the ministerial offices. But it takes me a couple of hours to walk my students through this diagram to explain it. We've tried to do it in 5 minutes. God help the poor minister who's appointed to do this.
Well, one other thing that came to mind is, maybe if you compared this to the UK and to the US, because with under AUKUS, how all this might actually work, or even the Five Eyes in terms of the 5 key intelligence communities and then how they stack up and just how complicated this is. One thought comes to mind is it's complicated for a reason, because that's part of the intelligence sort of playbook in keeping it complicated to cloak what you need. And the other one is exactly that of, do we have the skills at a ministerial level to cover all of this? Will, your thoughts on the skill set for the minister itself? And then one other thing I find with government at the moment is continuity. Like they're chopping and changing all over the place, so that by the time someone gets across this and starts to look at policy and help implement, they're going to be moved.
Yeah. Look, it's a very difficult thing when ministers aren't able to have time to really embed themselves and sink their roots into the portfolio. And it does, they need that time. I think in terms of the skills, and I guess why I've focused on recommending a Minister for Intelligence as opposed to something like, a National Security Advisor, which existed under the Rudd government, which was a public service appointment, is that it's actually really important that you have someone who's a political actor who's able to engage with the parliamentary process, to engage with the committees, but also to engage with their own party room, to engage with the crossbench, to engage with the opposition. Because the national security changes that we will need to have to debate publicly and within the parliament into the future are not always going to have, this tradition of bipartisan support that's existed. We can point to some recent examples such as the ASIO, there's an amendment to the ASIO Act for foreign intelligence recently, which was rushed through the parliament quite quickly. And it had bipartisan support between the coalition and Labor, but the crossbench members of the Senate were quite grumpy about having this significant amendment to the ASIO bill kind of pop up in front of them. And I think that goes to show that there is a need to be able to engage with the full breadth of Parliament on these issues, build that political consensus for the changes that we might need to undertake as we enter a pretty kind of hostile and volatile security environment into the coming years. So I think that's quite an essential thing. And dare I say, if we imagine that perhaps we might go into minority government into the future, that role of building political consensus, particularly with crossbench and independent MPs, becomes even more essential for maintaining that kind of national solidarity on issues of national security, so that we don't have, disruptive deviations about what is in the national interest and what is best for our national security. You mentioned, the complexity being potentially, by design. And I think that that's right, in the sense that our system, we have created under law, and John mentioned the Hope Royal Commission, we've created some very clear legal demarcations about what certain agencies are able to do and what they're not able to do. And we've created distinctions, for example, about domestic intelligence collection versus foreign. So those types of demarcations are really important. But as John's diagram there, the alphabet soup really demonstrates, is it's just become so unwieldy at that ministerial level to understand and to navigate. And it's a good thing in a way. We have, as a middle power country, we have an incredibly sophisticated national security apparatus that are able to do some amazing things operationally and really do bring, really quite significant contributions to things like our Five Eyes partnership. But it just means that we also need to be modernizing those political institutions to keep up, because it's worth remembering that, our federal Commonwealth structure is fairly unchanged from its kind of 19th century origins, but it now has to be applied to a 20th century threat environment, which, is pretty dicey.
I want you to hold that thought for the audience because when we move to the next guest as well. So that 19th century framework that now is facing 20th century problems and challenges, it's exactly what, because this is government, and then the next session that we're going to have with Gav Schneider is on looking at the security industries from an industry perspective, having to deal with all of this. I think the other observation I'd make on this graph, and definitely, I'm so glad we brought it up, because the report really talks to this type of sort of structure. The other thing is, I think this also displays the legislative framework rather than maybe operational framework, because most of these agencies will be working in task force approaches where they're all, across ever. And I'm former Australian Crime Commission. You'd be working, you bring everyone in together, basically. You got the analysts from all sorts of areas, and all of those in red in the NIC agencies will be working across each other at any one point. You'll have a whole mix of them in those. So whether operationally, maybe John, your thoughts on how at the NIC level, at the actual operation, most of them will be working hand in hand, and then it's that reporting structure and what, because I found, like the ASIOs, ASIS and ASD, even ASD now have domestic capability as well as foreign. So that's changing as well. So they can get by that, maybe a legislative barrier, simply because they just go to that agency. Oh, you've got the power to do that. Okay, well, you're in the task force. We can do it. Is that maybe about right?
Well, you're right to touch on the different legislative remits, and a lot of the amendments to legislation seem to be about enabling interagency cooperation on time-sensitive issues. And the problem is that the domain keeps shifting. So, one iteration of attempts to manage the challenge are then outpaced by changes in technology and changes in threat actor response approaches and tactics. So it means that there will continue to be changes. So, there is I think, an understandable fear of this creeping legislation being some kind of deep state plot to trap us all into, an Orwellian world. I don't believe that. I don't think that's right. But I think it's really important that this is explained clearly to the Australian people, and that the measures have appropriate checks and balances. So, because we see a lot of interdepartmental task forces these days that are about making the system work, overcoming the genuine and appropriate mechanisms for constraining the abuse of power and enabling, facilitating a timely response in the face of very nimble threat actors responding and acting. But we do need to bring the Australian people along with us. And Dennis Richardson's review of 2019, which I was just reviewing this morning, makes very, very clear a number of really useful points about the ongoing utility of maintaining the separation of powers, legislative powers, and making sure that is something that is explained to the Australian people, and that we have a sense of perspective on the history. It's one of the reasons why I touched on the Hope Royal Commissions, because what we have is a series of mechanisms and instrumentalities that have emerged from reform, from failure, and from rebuke and criticism, and from reconstruction emerging from failure, that has developed a set of instruments that are actually pretty robust, and that require tweaking around the edges, and Will's suggestions really fit into that space, and that require, I guess, a balance of the the accountability mechanisms, the bits in orange and yellow and blue, and versus the powers, the growing powers of the red boxes, and the growing kind of bleeding between the red boxes of the functions and of the powers that they exercise. And this is, I think, a really important point that it's one of the reasons why I tried to put this diagram out there, to help Australian people understand the complexity of what we've got, how unique it is. It's not the American model. It's not the British one either. It's bespoke. It's really it's homegrown to our circumstances. But it does need to continue to adapt. And so Will's right to stress this and to make the point that we do need some better oversight mechanisms. If, you know, I mean, to be fair, Will, and I didn't talk about this before, but if anything, I would say Will's ideas should actually trigger in us an aspiration to go further. There really is a scope for more reform, for more muscling up of the IGES function, of the PJCIS function, of the ability for the oversight mechanisms to have sufficient authority, power, and resources to hold that Damocles sword over the national intelligence community, because we have given them so much power for the trust of the Australian people to be retained. This ministerial appointment Will's talking about is important. With that is a really robust independent accountability mechanisms. I know from days when I used to work at what was then DSD a number of years ago now, after the ISA came in, the Intelligence Services Act of 2001, a real sense came to the community of, every keystroke we type can be audited by the enduring powers of the Royal Commissioner, the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security. Very powerful tool, very powerful authority invested in the IGES and his team, or her team. A point I would make, though, is the IGES really has not kept up with resourcing, with numbers, with strength to complement the capabilities. So what we're seeing in the PJCIS space it's really a problem. I would even suggest, and Will and I haven't talked about this, and it's only because of Will's work that this has even come up. So a credit to you, Will. But perhaps there's scope for some subcommittees in the PJCIS space, because there really is now that PJCIS originally was about the collection agencies, you know, the SIGINT, HUMINT, GeoINT, and domestic home security int functions, and the analytical ones that are primarily in the other agencies have fallen into that space. But perhaps there's a space for us to consider a separation of the collection and the analytical domains as subcommittees to enable better resourcing of secretariats and of, you know, as Will says, some of these security cleared people to work in that space to facilitate effective management of the functions.
I think on that, Will, you've got 5 recommendations here, and it's pretty much talking to what John's saying. And I don't know, John, if you've actually read the report, but you've just kind of said what number 2 and 3 recommendations are. Will, maybe talk us to those.
Yeah, so the additional ones are about empowering the PJCIS to really leverage the IGES and the Independent National Security Legislation Monitor. So John's idea of the subcommittees is an interesting one, because what's recently arisen is that the PJCIS, because of the sheer volume and complexity of the work that they are undertaking, has actually started to go to the INSLM, the legislation monitor, and say, can you review this for us and come back to us with a report, which is quite an innovation. But the trouble is with the INSLM is that it's a part-time appointment and has not really been envisaged to be stood up for that purpose. But I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with it. I think if you resource the INSLM appropriately, made it a full-time appointment, there's no reason that it couldn't be a standing body that the PJCIS could say, commission reports for. And in addition to that, I also recommended that the PJCIS, and this was Michael L'Estrange's recommendation back in 2017 as well, that the PJCIS be enabled to commission the IGES to undertake investigations. Because at the moment, the IGES can initiate its own investigations, but it is not directed to do so by the PJCIS. So going back again to this idea of building confidence and consensus within Parliament on national security, if the PJCIS was empowered to be able to direct the IGIS to investigate things that are of interest to Parliament, they can really be quite assured that they are getting the information that they want, because the way the system is at the moment, the PJSIS can set up an inquiry into a given issue, take submissions, usually, you have public-facing submissions, and then they'll get some classified briefings, but they are very dependent on what agencies decide to tell them in that context. Now, we can trust that agency heads will be quite forward-leaning and professional in making sure that Parliament is well appraised. However, if you're a parliamentarian and if you're perhaps, of a more skeptical mind towards the national security community, you don't really have a lot of options at your disposal to really seek out the information that you feel you would need to be confident in, in the issues that you're being asked to make a decision on. And just on the oversight piece, IGIS is, as John said, quite the sort of Damocles hanging over our community. I think one of my concerns, though, is that the raft of oversight that now exists has been created in quite an unstrategic way. And we're seeing duplications of oversight. And even if you look at recent legislation, so there's recent amendments, the Surveillance Legislation Amendment Act, that put in place specific oversight for specific types of warrants that are available to the AFP and the ACIC. Now, the trouble with that is, in the context of an investigation, you'll be using a myriad of different warrants at once. But so to have one warrant that's got a different form of oversight and then another that has a different one can become quite prohibitive and quite complicated for planning operations, particularly time-sensitive ones. So my concern is that this kind of bevy of different oversight organizations and different oversight mechanisms actually creates a situation where you might have agencies say, look, it's great that we have that power, but it's just too complicated for us to use in the time that we've got. And other forms of oversight that have popped up as well is specific types of reporting to specific committees, sunsetting clauses of specific powers. And I'm just concerned that what that actually does is that puts a handbrake on the utility of these powers and doesn't actually really improve transparency for the Australian public, because now you've just got too many different organisations to go to. You've got the Inspector General, you've got the INSLM, you've got the Australian Commission of Law Enforcement Integrity, you've got the Parliament, you've got the Commonwealth Ombudsman, the list goes on. And I just think that, there's potentially an opportunity in the future to really strengthen oversight, but also make it streamlined and more efficient.
We may yet have an ICAT coming through as well. So where that's going to fit. Yeah. And in terms of, so look, well done, John. We did give it half an hour to cover off the whole national intelligence community discussion, but the focus here was to highlight Will's report. It is on, we put the media release on the Australian Security magazine, and the report is available at an Australian National University as well. And I don't know if the answer is for a minister to be I like some of the Twitter responses that we had in terms of are there ministers out there with intelligence, or were you after a minister for intelligence? That was, I thought, quite clever. But one thing it does highlight, and you've come sort of independently, Will, to it, is the complexity here, and the legislative frameworks does require some oversight. And that's something that I think that theme that we've been following through is national security strategy and a national resilience strategy. One final question I might finish off on: would this structure, or what you're calling for as a Minister for Intelligence, would that change if it became impetus in terms of, say, a war, a major conflict in our region that escalated? Would that change, John, maybe historically, maybe looking at major wars, the structure of all of this changes in a major conflict, or it's operationally ready for a major conflict as it is?
Yeah, I mean, no one knows the future, and we can't quite predict how things might change. But we are already on a continuum of what I would describe: cooperation, competition, contestation, coercion, and conflict. It's already there. We're already happening. It's happening in the cyber domain. It's happening in the shoals of the South China Sea. It's happening in the line of actual control in the Himalayas. It's happening in the rhetoric coming out of Beijing and the wolf warrior diplomacy. It's happening in the sanctions, and it's happening in the competition, certainly in terms of the dramatic and exponential growth in military capabilities emerging in China. So these things are already happening.
It's happening between allies.
Yeah, we haven't crossed a kinetic threshold. But I would just add one little point as well. There is, because of that continuum, and there's a blurring between things that's happening domestically and internationally, and the whole issue about foreign interference is this issue about a competitive, contestational international relations that's happening in our own domestic politics as well. And I think there's another dimension here that's about policing and intelligence. And with the Home Affairs construct, we touched on the Australian Law Enforcement Integrity Commissioner, Ackley, which is in the diagram. But the policing powers, policing is about looking for finding evidence of a historical event to take someone to court. Intelligence is about predicting something that might happen in the future. It's like water and oil. And we've blended these two kind of the agencies and functions in this space, which means it's actually quite difficult to manage. So when we think about an Minister for Intelligence, we've also got to think about that policing space, which is not just a federal function either. It's a state and federal function. Very, very complicated. We haven't got time to go there today, but it goes to show you that, yes, it probably is more change afoot in future.
Very good. Well, look, Dr. William Stoltz, Senior Advisor for Public Policy at the National Security College there in Canberra with the Australian National University, and Professor John Blaxland, Professor of International Security and Intelligence Studies, Strategic and Defence Studies Centre, Bell School, CAP and the Australian National University. John and Will, thank you so much for your time this morning. Absolute pleasure, and I'll send the links out following this session. Look forward to the next time.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks very much. I'll put you both backstage. And John was a great segue there to our next guest. Mentioned the Department of Home Affairs. And so without further ado, let's bring on Dr. Gavriel, or Gav Schneider. Gav, thanks for joining us again.
Thanks, Chris. Great to chat to you.
And while I've got you up there, I'll swap that around. Conference Convenor. So we're going to touch on the Protective Security and Government Conference next week, 14th and 15th. And you're also the project co-lead and senior researcher for Security 25, a roadmap for the future. Let's touch on the report itself. I think this was this was sponsored and facilitated by the Australian Security Industry Association Limited, or ASIAL, and I'm a member of ASIAL. Maybe talk us through the report and what your key findings are. And I might be a little bit skeptical on the outcomes of these types of reports, but let's see how we go in terms of if anyone's listening.
Thanks, Chris. And skepticism is totally understood.
Good, and, thank you.
We can absolutely explore that a little bit as we go. So my business, Risk2Solution, acquired the Australian Security Research Centre about 3 or 4 years ago, and ASIAL basically contracted us to do the study into where we think the security industry should be going in 2025 and how to get there. So the basis of any future-looking study is, you can't forecast where you want to go if you don't know where you are. So we had to start off with, a bit of a research focus to understand where we were at. So that part consisted of a big survey that went out. We had hundreds of responses from security providers. It also went out to security users. We ran, I think, 7 focus groups. We did 18 interviews and a really robust international literature review. We then merged all of that together and tried to get to a point where we could do a SWOT analysis. And from that SWOT analysis, we then put together a roadmap of where we think the industry should be going based on where it's at. So, it has been Australia's largest study into the security industry to date. And, while none of us have a crystal ball, it was really interesting to sort of look and explore as to what we think good looks like. And, if nothing else, the report at the very least does highlight what good could look like for a security industry.
Some of the stats, and let's just highlight, there is a security report executive summary available, and then the report is also available for ASIAL members And we've also got it for sale on the MySecurity marketplace as well. So you can access the full report. Otherwise, an executive summary is available. So the estimated annual revenue generated by the Australian private security industry is approximately $11 billion per annum. And that's estimated to be growing at about 3% annual growth now and through to 2028. And then we are employing over 180,000 people, including 153,000 licensed security personnel. And it's significantly larger than the combined size of the Australia's police and defence forces, which is, again, a good segue from what we've just been discussing with Will and John. What is the, I suppose for the audience, the key ones? What would be your top threes, Gav, out of this, that maybe if you're talking to the three people, one, talking to government, talking to the industry, and then maybe talking to the professionals themselves, say you and I at a consultancy level, what we would be looking at. So what's the sort of the top ones for government that we need to be asking for or seeking?
Sure. I think let's take the key finding from my perspective, and there were many, in a 100-page report, there's a lot of stuff you can pull out. But I think the key thing that we really found is that, no one role player or stakeholder can be responsible for professionalizing an industry. And there's this perception among, for example, providers that, AZL must solve the problems, or regulators must solve the problems, or government must solve the problem. So really, probably the big key takeaway for me is that there were three key stakeholder groups we identified that all need to, contribute to improving and professionalizing the industry. That's the providers, the people actually providing the service.
Yep.
And it's really important to note that that's not, specific to saying, oh, it's the guards or the electronic security or the cyber security. It's really the idea that convergence is coming hard and fast, whether we like it or not. Organizations are maturing where they just want to solve problems and manage risks and threats. And the way we've siloed our organizations, industries, and provision is not necessarily helping achieve that, nor will it be sustainable as things change, which I think is a topic we'll get into shortly.
Yeah.
So it really is the sum total of the providers, the regulators, and the users that all have things to do. Obviously, there are additional stakeholders, the media, other government agencies that have a critical role to play. And you mentioned earlier, and it's a great segue from what John and Will were talking about, that one of the biggest pieces that, this is not a new issue for anyone in the security industry, but it kept coming up again, was this national consistency, national licensing. And what was really interesting in doing the research is we totally expected that to be something that providers were unhappy about because we know. But it was really interesting to see that users were also unhappy about it.
Yep.
And it caused a lot of frustration for, chief security officers, security managers who had multi-state operations, who had different rules and different regulations to play within each state. And linking that to the idea of national security, how can the private security industry play the role it can play, which is a significant force multiplier? It is a significant protective structure. If you think about it, and to your point around the statistic that the security industry is larger than all our law enforcement and defense personnel combined, it's a significant role player in protecting not just business interests, but who's guarding army bases, who's guarding government government buildings, who's actually securing cyber infrastructure. It's the private security industry that's doing all of those things, whatever banner they work under. So, this idea of coming together is really important. This idea of some sort of national consistency is really important. And then I think the third one, since you asked for three, there's we could put out, is around the perception, the image of the industry. And whether we like it or not, our industry does not have a great reputation, and the media certainly doesn't help that. No offense, Chris. But realistically...
Well, that's why we're here, actually. That's why we're trying to professionalize it and bring it up. But keep going with your point. But I've got some thoughts there.
So let's just take COVID as an example. The security industry got slammed in the hotel quarantine debacle down in Victoria. And, once the commission was held and all of that, arguably it switched where you could go, actually, hold on, the security personnel and the security providers were actually victims of poor contract management, poor standard setting, and lack of duty of care.
Yep.
But that never made the media.
But I think the other point, and maybe the report will broaden that out, is the depth and the breadth of the security industry is also that's part of the problem, is bringing them all together. And I've always found that the industry is segregated, and then you can pick, and that's what the media does. We'll pick pieces of, well, that's just the security industry. It's a security guard, so therefore that represents the whole security industry. Whereas cybersecurity, it's sort of often segregated out of the security industry, but actually, as you say, it's converged now that they both have dual roles in one. And anyone looking at cybersecurity is obviously going to be looking at physical security too, but they're not necessarily subject to licenses and the licensing and regulation framework as well. In fact, there's no regulation for cybersecurity practitioners, which is ironic. Anything come out of that for this report?
A little, not too much. In fact, it was kind of interesting to note that while we had lots of calls for cybersecurity professionals to engage with us, they were one specific specialist group that we had low engagement from.
Right.
Okay, and that's telling in its own right that there's a lot of resistance to this idea that people from the ICT sector actually are part of the security sector. And conversely, it's quite similar in many parts of the security industry the other way. Where even electronic security experts, who in many ways are doing cybersecurity.
Yeah, of course.
They also kind of resist the, oh no, we don't do cybersecurity. We do, access control, or we do integrated security solutions. But just the term integrated, kind of gives it away.
Yeah.
So I think the convergence piece, it's coming, whether we like it or not. And what we try to do in the report was to provide some key guidance points or roadmap suggestions for those three stakeholders to help us move forward. Okay? And it was really interesting to note that, a lot of the stakeholders, when we're doing the research, particularly the ones from, electronic security providers, etc., we're quite passionate that, by 2025, technology, automation, robotics are going to disrupt the industry, blah, blah, blah. We're going to go the way of Singapore. And we actually interviewed people from Singapore during this research, and the feedback they told us is Australia's 20 years behind us. So, and the other thing we found, and there's a whole section in the report on this, is by 2025, we are not going to be where the US, UK, and Singapore are from a technology adoption perspective. Our environment is different. We will eventually get there. We will have no choice because, the realities of efficiencies, cost saving, etc., will drive automated solutions, but it probably won't happen at the expense of man guarding. It will probably happen together with man guarding because they will just become more specialized and integrated functions over time.
Well, we've also got the things like robotics and drones, and you see AWS coming out with a home robot now. And is that a security device? If it's monitoring and conducting surveillance and the like. I suppose this leads to the PSG, Protective Security in Government Conference, because as I mentioned, in you're wearing various hats, but maybe talk us through the lineup, because how much of the report are you putting forward at the conference? Because you've got some real heavy hitters there in government as well to say, look, here's a report. We've done some thinking about it, and we've gone out and asked a lot of people, and here's 100 pages to read. But we want some change. And again, I come back to that key point I raised in our first session with Will and John, and we are dealing with a federated system that's 100 years old, and we're trying to apply it now in 2021. It's just not going to happen. If it didn't happen during the pandemic, it's never going to happen. Tell me I'm wrong.
So the optimist in me says never say never, but it's certainly, listening to John and Will just around the complexity and the acronym alphabet and, who's reporting to who and who has authority over who, it certainly is a complex challenge. But I think there's a few things we have to bear in mind, and I'll segue between the report and PSG as we go. One of the things that the report highlighted was obviously the critical role that the security sector plays in national security, and that we also have a huge opportunity to expand that capability, evolve that capability to further support national security, disaster response, emergency management, you name it. But, and this is the big but, for that to happen, we need consistency. And this is part of that interesting challenge. So, when was it? Probably when the Protective Security Policy Framework reforms came out, which I think they were released in 2018, the federal government didn't have the Security and Government Conference they used to have. They stopped running that in 2017 or 16, I think. So we were asked by attorney generals, could we put on an event that would enable them to share the PSPF reforms? And we did. And this has grown into now, 3 to 4 years later, the modern version of the Protective Security and Government Conference, which, to your point, is a real cracker this year. We've got ministers, we've got the head of the UK Preparedness Commission, Lord Toby Harris. We've got guys heading up US Department of Homeland Security CISA program. The list just goes on and on. And what we've really tried to do this year is get this melting pot of thought leadership going in the protective security space. So while it is government-centric, if you are involved in security or risk, you really do need to look at this, because there will be something there for you that you will want to know about, grab, or understand.
Yep.
What we try to do is look at things like critical infrastructure. And I think Will and John both mentioned the new SOKI legislation that's coming out. So we wanted to be able to get people from Home Affairs and other stakeholders to talk a bit about that, so that people hear directly from those key government authorities what their appetites and what's going on there. We also obviously, with the changing dynamics in our geopolitical situation, want people to get a threat update and some understanding of what's going on with that stuff. And needless to say, because of COVID, cyber has become bigger than it ever was and will continue that momentum. So we've integrated and focused a lot on cyber. We've got the head of the Australian Cybersecurity Centre and a whole bunch of other really influential providers and stakeholders in the cybersecurity world to come and share. And at the same time, we've got long-term practitioners, people like Tim Corey, who have been in government security for decades, sharing some of their experience. We've also tried to look at some of the segue skill sets. So we've got Don Bletchley, who's the Chief of Transport, Network Security and Resilience for Queensland Government at TMR. Don's had a long career of floods, fires, you name it, COVID. And his department has been the leader in incident emergency response. So we've got this big melting pot of ideas and people coming through. The other thing, obviously, we did have to shift online. It's a bit soul-destroying because we had a really cool setup at the National Press Club in Canberra and a whole bunch of things running there. But there are pros. And I think the pros with that are it's going to be recorded. So if you buy a ticket and you can't come to the whole thing, you can watch it later or pick the pieces you want to review. There's a whole bunch of freebies. ASIAL has offered, the full Security 2025 report, as you mentioned, I think it's just under $1,000. The ASIAL website. It's free if you buy a PSG ticket.
Oh, nice.
Which is very nice of ASIAL. And there's a whole bunch of other things that we're working on to create value adds and things that make it useful. So I would urge anybody in the security industry, please spread the word. It's going to be worth your while. And it's one of those, it literally is a once-in-a-year event that does bring together private, public, and starts this convergence conversation happening at a real level where we're looking at cyber, physical, protective security, crisis management, risk management, all in an integrated melting pot.
Well, what I can say is what I would like to see out of the conference, given the lineup that you've got, and as you say, you've got some real, you've got policy there as well as the practitioner side, is to align it with the Security 2025 report on the outcomes, and just, I think, particularly the content, and try to capture where our political leaders and our industry leaders see where things are going, and to give some direction, given the complexity, as you've pointed out, and as John and Will pointed out, within the government framework itself, because we are asking Department of Home Affairs to take leadership at a federal level over sort of the state police agencies, slightly different structures in each state on how they regulate the industry as well, but to get some national consistency, at least so it can be a bit more easier to circumvent each one's. And I think that's the key one. And unfortunately, ASIAL's obviously beaten up continuously about this, because they're on the front line in terms of an industry association trying to change that, and they've been talking about it for so long. As you say, they're quite patient and optimistic, as you are. But yeah, what are some of the other key ones out of the report itself that you thought took you by surprise, or that you'd like to highlight?
So I think there's many, as we discussed, but let's just talk a little bit more around the methodology as to why we suggested a security industry coordination office be formed at Home Affairs, and why Home Affairs. We interviewed and we ran a focus group with all the different regulators around the country, and they don't have an easy job either, and I think this is one of the things that providers often forget is without regulators, it becomes exceptionally chaotic. We get, really bad behavior, because if, we talk about an industry, a lot of people threw up things like sham contracting as one of those key problems. Imagine how bad that would be if we didn't have regulation, I think it's important we don't position ourselves to say we're not for some sort of regulation or minimum standards. What we are looking at is streamlining and efficiency. And what we want to do is be able to contribute to national security in a really meaningful way, not a coincidental or, ancillary way when things go wrong and there's a need to uplift capability or get more bodies on the ground. So realistically, Home Affairs, is the umbrella security agency for federal government, driving the SOCI legislation and many other pieces. If we didn't have one sort of federally driven structure that actually, for lack of a better descriptor, actually said to everybody, hey, this is not in the national interests. It's, to be honest, not even in your state's interests. You carry on doing the same thing you've repeatedly done. I was on another podcast with Cameron Smith, who runs SLED in New South Wales. And, he was quite open saying that, hey, we lose money out of the security industry regulation portfolio. And it's not a moneymaker for us. And, we have no choice but to keep going where we're at, because we have no better alternative. We're trying to do the best we can. And it's really interesting because ultimately, unless there is a national driven initiative that goes, and you asked John Blaxland the point, what happens if we go to war? It is something to think about. Nobody thought we would lock down for 2 years and our economy would be torn into shambles. And that happened. If we go to war and we don't have these national structures, trust me, they will happen like that. Okay.
Well, that's my point, is if it didn't happen during a pandemic, is it actually going to happen? And you're going to find WA will go, okay, well, if Australia's at war, that's the time we're actually, we're out of here. So it has highlighted the fact that it's unlikely to happen in the near term, even if there is a major conflict, because if a national pandemic isn't the trigger, I don't know what is.
And to support your point there, one of the things that we really want to do of this report, and, to be honest, it's the driver for my businesses, it's the driver for PSG, is those things that are manageable and preventable. It's really poor show when we don't do the right thing and actually proact where possible. And even this discussion around resilience, it's a great discussion, but where's the resilience? Where's the prevention? Where's the preparation? Where's the getting ready or the stopping the bad things happening? We're so fixated on this respond and recover thing, which is critical, but we've lost sight of how much control we have to prevent and potentially empower. So, hopefully, and this is really the hope. Yes, it is probably slightly optimistic to say that, our motherhood statement, which is a paragraph of what would good look like in the report, it's pretty optimistic to say that would happen by 2025. But if it's just a little bit better, and if, for example, if you're a provider, a regulator, or a user, and you read the report and you go, that part is interesting, I want to do something about that, we're already moving in the right direction.
Yeah. And
ultimately, nobody's got a crystal ball, but, we can, with a fair amount of certainty, say things are coming down the line. We identified some technology megatrends, which whether, somebody's in cyber or runs a guarding company, you're not going to be providing good advice to your clients. You're not going to be securing your business or your department effectively unless you're aware of these things and at the very least know where to source expertise, even if you don't want to build it yourself.
Well, I think this is the decade of massive change, as you say, for the industry, but for all industry sectors. And that technology aspect is going to be another, that mega trend, as you say, as things that we're not going to be able to avoid. And we're under major change right now, as John highlighted as well, in terms of that contestation and conflict. So look, Dr. Gavriel, Gav Schneider, the Group CEO of Risk2Solution, thank you so much for your time. We obviously could have gone for the full hour, but it's been an absolute pleasure. So get along next week, the 14th and 15th of October. We do have this on the MySecurity marketplace, so you can go to there.com, and otherwise there was Alicia put the link in for the conference as well on LinkedIn. And otherwise, you can also access the report, Security 2025, a roadmap for the future. That is also available on the marketplace or free to ASIAL members. Or if you get along to the Protective Security Conference, you'll also get a copy of the full report. And as John mentioned in the background there, that is a cracker of the report. I'll quote you. There you go. It's a cracker of a report from John Blaxland, Gav, so you can't get better accolades than that.
I was going to say, Chris, my work is done. If Professor John Blaxland says it's a good report,
there you go.
I'm good.
Wonderful. Well, look, I'll let you go, mate. Thank you so much, and I'll do some finishing off with the reports of the week and what we've got coming up. So thanks, Gav. Pleasure having you back on. Cheers, mate. All righty, and just to finish up and let you know what we've got coming up. The current reports of the week. I haven't since we've dived into two particular reports this morning. The current reports, the latest reports on the marketplace. We've got the Internet Security Report quarter from WatchGuard, State of Cybersecurity Automation Adoption in 2021 from Threat Quotient. The Threat Report T2 it's T2. What is T? I can't remember what T stands for. Maybe Trends 2 2021. And then this one was a good one. Cybersecurity for power grid protection devices, worth having a look at. That's from Europe and the DNV. So recommended practice for that. That's certainly anyone in critical infrastructure should be looking at that. State of PKI Automation 2021 from DigiCert is out. And I mentioned the Security 2025 report, a roadmap for the future, is available in the marketplace for $9.95. Otherwise, if you want to get a copy of that. Our latest editions of Cyber Risk Leaders and the Australian Cybersecurity Magazine will be out very shortly. Last chance to get an article or a piece in there if you want to contribute. And we'll be back on Tuesday afternoon for Michelle Price, the CEO of AusCyber, having a look at the Cyber Week 2021, the Australian Cyber Week, which will be the last week of October. And then also next Wednesday, we'll be with ClearSale and David Fletcher there in the US, and Ralph Coy, Australia's country manager, looking at fraud trends and prevention frameworks. And then on the 28th of October with Motorola Solutions, Warehouse and Manufacturing in Transformation, with Victor Nigem and Logan Caulfield as well. So again, check that out on the MySecurity marketplace or our Learn Security platform, with a whole host of other content there available on demand. So that's it from me. Thank you so much, and enjoy your Friday and your weekend. And those in New South Wales, look forward to your Monday. You're out of lockdown, so well done. And again, thank you very much for joining us on MySecTV, Tech and Sec Weekly.